be learned by hearing people. American Sign Language is an example, French Sign Language, British Sign Language, Australian Sign Language. There are a lot of them. School sign languages are kind of idiosyncratic languages that are used by deaf students in schools where signed languages are not used in instruction. So especially if there was a residential school where children were taught using spoken language and were not allowed to use sign language, then these sort of underground sign languages would develop that the kids used in secret and shared among themselves and with new students who would come to the school. Next slide. So interestingly, British Sign Language and American Sign Language are completely different languages. They evolved separately. They are not mutually understandable. So when British deaf people and American deaf people meet each other, they usually would communicate with written English or gestures and spoken and mouthed English words. But for interesting historical reasons, French Sign Language and American Sign Language are very closely related. Deaf French and deaf Americans can usually converse and understand each other. So if deaf people are traveling in France and deaf Americans, and they meet deaf French people, they can usually have a conversation, even though they may have some differences in their vocabulary. Next slide. When I made this presentation, I wrote it up about 3 or 4 years ago. At the time, there were about 300 documented sign languages in the world. Most countries in Latin America have a known sign language. There's an interesting language that's been studied since the 80s in Nicaragua. I don't know how much they're able to do right now, but there was a mountain community with congenital deafness that had its own sign language. Canadians use American Sign Language or French Canadian Sign Language. There are 2 sign languages in Italy, Northern and Southern Italian Sign Language, and Namibian Sign Language and South African Sign Language are very closely related. Interestingly, during apartheid, deaf students in South Africa were taught with sign language and white students were taught with spoken language. And the Black students actually I should have said Black deaf students in South Africa were taught with sign language. White students were taught with spoken language. And the Black students actually were much more successful and overall better educated. There are at least 2 sign languages known in Mexico. North Carolina used to have a Black sign language, which, for years people talked about the Black sign language that was a result of segregation and had evolved at the School for the Deaf in Raleigh. That was the Black school. It may still be used by a few older adults in the eastern part of the state, although most of them have passed away by now. And, I've always wondered, it wasn't studied very thoroughly or documented. I'm not sure it was a completely different language. It may have been a different dialect, but anecdotally, people talked about Black people in North Carolina had a different sign language. So it is customary in the deaf community or in the deaf culture to capitalize the D in deaf when people are talking about their identity, not their audiological status. Hard of hearing is a very commonly used term, but most culturally deaf people don't like to be called hearing impaired. They consider it a medical term, whereas the for many deaf people, their deafness is a cultural and linguistic identity, not, they don't consider it a medical condition. I remember one time a deaf guy I saw on campus at Gallaudet University, and he was wearing earphones and he was dancing, and I asked one of my friends, is he deaf? And she said, or no, I said, is he hearing? I think was what I asked her. And she goes, no, he's deaf, but he can hear a lot. So, and she was talking about his identity as a deaf person, not his audiological status. Next slide. So Martha's Vineyard Sign Language is traced back to Jonathan Lambert, who was a deaf man from Kent, England, who settled with his family in the town of Chilmark, which is on the western end of Martha's Vineyard. By the 1800s, 1 in 25 people in Chilmark were deaf, and Martha's Vineyard Sign Language was used by deaf and hearing people, and deafness was reported to be a somewhat unremarkable characteristic. Deaf kids and hearing kids went to school together, that if a deaf person joined the conversation, everybody would just switch to sign language. There was a book written about it called Everyone Here Spoke Sign Language. It was an ethnographic study where they interviewed people who had grown up during that time. And one of my favorite anecdotes from it, they were interviewing an older woman about one of her neighbors that she'd had when she was younger. And they, just asking about him. And she talked all about what a good farmer he was and aspects of his personality. And she kind of went on about him. And the interviewer asked, well, was he deaf or was he hearing? And she had to actually stop and think about it. And she said, come to think of it, he was deaf and dumb. But him being deaf was not something that she even remembered until she went back and sort of searched her brain for it. Next slide. So you can see down on the left side the town of Chilmark, and that's where a whole bunch of deaf people lived. And when the School for the Deaf was built on the mainland, the kids started going to school on the mainland, and eventually the language just died out. Next slide. So Alexander Graham Bell, will learn, if you don't know, why deaf people consider him an enemy. They hate him. He's just vilified. He studied the deafness on the island, and it was also studied by an ethnographer named Nora Grace, who wrote Everyone Here Spoke Sign Language. The last known resident with Lambert's deaf gene on the island died in 1952, but many deaf families in the United States trace their origins back to Martha's Vineyard. So I want to tell you the story of Alice Cogswell. She's almost a mythical figure, or or legendary, I guess, in the deaf culture. She was the first child in the United States who was deaf, who received an education. So the statue that you see here is on the campus of Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. And it's just a lovely piece. Let's go to the next slide. Alice Cogswell was born in 1805, and at the age of 2, she became deaf. And in 1814, Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet met her while he was visiting Hartford, Connecticut. So she was, 9 years old, I guess, and had been deaf since she was 2. Next slide. Her father, Mason Cogswell, was wealthy, and he funded a trip to England for Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet to learn methods for educating deaf students, because he wanted his daughter to have an education. So Gallaudet first went to England to try to learn the techniques that they were using. And England pretty exclusively educated their deaf students without sign language. And they were protective of their methodology, and they wouldn't share it with him. While he was in England, he met, I don't speak French, but I think it's Abbé Sicard, who was the director of the School for Deaf Students in Paris, and two deaf teachers, Laurent Claire and Jean Messieu, I don't know how to pronounce it. Anyway, he traveled back to Paris with them so he could learn their methods. And they used French Sign Language as the language of instruction at the School for the Deaf in Paris. So when Gallaudet returned to the US, Laurent Claire came with him. And the story is that while they were sailing to the US, Claire taught French Sign Language to Gallaudet, and Gallaudet taught Claire to read and write English. Next slide. And in 1817, they established the first school for the deaf in the United States. It's still in use. It's the American School for the Deaf in Hartford, Connecticut. The official language of instruction at the American School for the Deaf was French Sign Language via Laurent Claire. It was influenced by Martha's Vineyard Sign Language and home signs that were brought by some students. So together, French Sign Language and Martha's Vineyard Sign Language, with some other influence, evolved into what is modern day American Sign Language, which is why deaf people from the United States and deaf people from France can understand each other and converse. Schools then opened in New York, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, Ohio, Virginia, Indiana, and within 40 years of the opening of the Hartford School, there were 20 more schools, and by the turn of the 20th century, there were more than 50. 40% of the teachers in these schools were deaf themselves, and deaf people look back at this time as sort of the golden age of deaf education, because it was being run and managed by deaf people for the benefit of deaf children. The North Carolina School for the Deaf was established in 1894. Interestingly, the enrollment is very small now for lots of reasons, but they are opening the western branch of the North Carolina School of Science and Mathematics on that campus. They're actually building now. So you had all these 19th century deaf people who were all of a sudden educated, and they needed to do something with them because some of them were ready for higher education. So in 1856, Amos Kendall donated 2 acres in northeast Washington, D.C. to establish a school for 12 deaf and 6 blind students. And then in 1857, Congress incorporated the new school, and Edward Minor Gallaudet, who was the son of Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet, became the school's first superintendent. In 1864, Congress authorized the institution to confer college degrees, and Abraham Lincoln actually signed the charter for Gallaudet College. And their first commencement was in 1869, and there were 3 young men who received diplomas. And these were the first college-educated deaf people in the United States. So here is the Charter of Gallaudet, and I don't know if it's kept in the archives there or displayed in the museum or if it's in the National Archives, but so we can move on to the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, passed the Senate on the same day that Abraham Lincoln signed the charter for Gallaudet College. So this was yes. So Daniel Chester French, let's go back to him. He is the sculptor. Remember the the sculpture I showed you of Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet and Alice Cogswell. Daniel Chester French was the sculptor who created that piece. And it was one of his, it's one of his nicest pieces, but his first important commission was the Minuteman, commemorating the Battle of Concord in 1875. He did this piece of Gallaudet and Alice Cogswell in 1888. And his best known work and his final work is the big marble statue of Abraham Lincoln in the Lincoln Memorial, which was dedicated in 1922. It is likely that the fame that he had from the Gallaudet statue helped get him the commission, or to do the Lincoln Memorial. So here's his Minuteman piece. And we can look next. And take a close look at this statue and look at Alice Cogswell's hand. She is holding her hand in the shape of the letter A, and she's holding a book. And he is her teacher who is teaching her the letter. So I want you to remember that hand shape. And then let's look at the next slide. This is the sign language, the American Sign Language sign for the letter L. And if we go to the next slide, take a look at Abraham Lincoln's hands. So his left hand is loosely, it's a loose fist, very much like the sign language A. And if you look at his right hand with this index finger just ever so slightly extended, there's sort of an echo of the L. And Daniel Chester French never confirmed it, but anybody who's looked at this, who knows the history and knows the American Sign Language alphabet, can see that he did a nod. It was 2 miles from the Alice Cogswell statue, but he put Abraham Lincoln's initials on his hands in sign language. So just a few linguistic features of American Sign Language that are kind of interesting if you like language. It takes longer to produce a sign than to say a word. And because of that, the language has evolved to have a fairly small vocabulary, but a very complex grammar. So some features of the grammar are very subtle and weren't recognized until the late 1970s with the advent of frame-by-frame video, where it could be really analyzed. Before that, deaf people thought hearing people learning to sign were just not expressive enough, and hearing educators thought that the language that their deaf students were using didn't have real structure or word order. But it actually has a very complex structure, and not all of it is on the hands. So just for example, there are 3 kinds of verb agreement in American Sign Language. In English and Spanish and most Romance languages, verbs agree with their subjects. So the subject of the sentence determines the form of the verb. You'd say, I go, she goes, or yo quiero y nosotros queremos. In American Sign Language, verbs never show subject-only agreement. Verbs can agree with their objects, and can y'all see me on video, or are you only seeing the screen?
We can see you.
All right.
All right.
So
You can...
I can give you an example. So like the sign tell, which looks like this, agrees with the object. You can say, tell me, tell him, tell her, tell them. So the verb changes depending on what the object of the verb is, but not what the subject is. Some verbs have no agreement, at all. Like the sign want um, doesn't really change based on what you want. But some verbs agree with subject and object. Like if this is the sign give, you can say give me, I give you, she gives him, he gives her. So the direction, the movement of the sign actually agrees with the subject and the object. But none of them are like the English subject agreement. Next slide. Pronouns are interesting in American Sign Language. They are designated during the discourse. And so like a location in the signing space will be identified and named. And then that location can be used for verb agreement. So it's kind of hard to do it. If I were in front of you, I could give you a better example, but it's interesting. There are also size and shape specifiers that can describe movement and location. So one of my favorite sign language utterances ever came from a 2-year-old. He was very fluent, really bright little guy. And he used this handshake for car. And we were driving down I-40 near the airport. And this is the handshake that's used for an airplane. And what he said was, we're driving forward and an airplane just took off over us. But he put all of that in this one sign. And it was just such a complex thing for him to observe and be able to describe. I thought it was really cool. Narrative structure, there's some specific ways that sign language stories are created. Stories are always told chronologically, and sentences also are structured chronologically. Time is specified in the narrative, and it's assumed until it changes. So verbs don't change to show past tense or future tense. That's done as part of the narrative structure. Perspective taking is pretty cool. Body shift in the narrative can eliminate the need for pronoun referencing. So shifting your body this way to show that one person said something, shifting your body this way to show that someone else, you're quoting a different person. So Scott Liddell was one of my professors at Gallaudet in grad school, and he was the one who figured out that facial features, facial movements were actually part of the grammar of American Sign Language. And he figured this out in the 1970s, which tells you, how recent any real study of this language has been happening. And he told us a great story. He had this, frame by frame video of people, native signers, meaning deaf people who had deaf parents and deaf grandparents. And he had these videos of people signing with each other, and he couldn't figure out what was going on with their faces. So he took the video to, and I wish I remembered the name of the guy, but he was an anthropologist who had studied facial expressions all over the world and found I think there were 5 universal facial expressions, like smiling and tense lower eyelids to show anger, disgust, that kind of wrinkled nose. So this guy had spent his entire academic career studying facial expressions. And maybe, Anne, that name sounds right. Would that have been in the 70s? Anyway, so he took these videos to him and said, "What's going on?" And the guy looked at them with him and said, "I've never seen anything like this in my life." And so this man who had studied facial expressions all over the world looked at these deaf people signing and said, I've never seen anything like this. And so Scott started analyzing, and he figured out the most basic, like yes, no questions are marked with an eyebrow raise and a forward lean and holding the last sign. WH questions are shown with lowered eyebrows, assertions with a head nod, negations by shaking your head across the entire utterance. This topicalization, which is a head tilt back and then a comment following. In English, we usually think of sentences having a subject and a predicate. In American Sign Language, it's more of a topic and then a comment, and they're both marked with the way you hold your eyebrows in your head. Conditional clauses and mouth morphemes. Can we click on that, Brand? This is interesting. We'll just look a little bit at this video.
There's no sound.
That's okay. So it can, this particular mouth movement, it's not a word, but it shows size and space, and it's about designating. This is a non-manual adverb that means carelessly, pretty much. Like walking carelessly. What's another one? Yeah. So she's showing again. This is an instructional video. Let's look at one more of these. Oh. Yeah. So this particular one with this like tight pursed lips can represent small size, but I don't know if it's actually the same as the beautiful, but definitely the thin and small would use this mouth movement. Okay, Brand, let's go back to the presentation. And let's go to the next. ASL grammatical aspects video and video sample. Let's look at that one really briefly, and then we'll look at
which one.
Things. Let's look at the grammatical aspects video. I'm trying to remember which one that was. Topic comment. So watch the way the head tilts back. Just saying ASL has different rules, structures. One that I'm going to pick to tell you about today and explain is called topic.
They can hear it.
You can hear her?
Oh.
Now I was sort of interpreting what she was saying.
Oh.
So how do you notice that something is a topic? Well, eyebrows raised and held up, and then you say something about it. Let me give you an example. That book, give it to me. See that book? Oh, that's thick. Wow. See that book? It's boring. I could go to sleep reading that. About that book, is it yours? So that one, the book, is it yours? Or book, whose is it? So we'll pause there. It was just interesting, you know, that she could make a lot of statements about that book. And in each one, when she shows that the book is the topic of what she's talking about, her eyebrows go up and her head goes back just a little. Okay, let's go back to the presentation.
By the way, how would one sign Patricia Saylor is a sailor?
Well, you'd have to add a little context on there. There'd be some finger spelling. So this, I just wanted to show you because it's such a beautiful story of the three little pigs. And while we look at it, I want you to notice this person's facial grammar, the way the eyebrows move, the head tilts, the body shifts when, taking the role of one pig versus another, the use of space and all these non-manual adverbs on the mouth. There is so much going on that you almost can't keep up with it all. And, but it's just a great example of American Sign Language storytelling. So let's just enjoy. Since it's a story you might be able to sort of follow along about what's going on. Three pigs, and the mother loves them. Those are the bricks.
She spelled out a few words.
Yeah, she spelled brick, but she also described it first.
They shaved.
No, they're sweating with the exertion of building the brick house. Wolf.
Devil. Hungry.
Hungry.
Flying.
Pig. She is a beautiful storyteller. Roll taking of the pig, fearful of the wolf, roll taking of the wolf. Yeah, Winston hears the wolf. Okay, so I don't think we need to hear the whole story. Everybody knows how it ends, but we can pause here and move on to so topics we could discuss, but we probably won't get to today. Alexander Graham Bell, yes, he had a deaf wife. And why did deaf people hate him so much? He was a eugenicist, is that the word I'm looking for? He wrote an essay called On the Creation of a Deaf Variety of the Human Race, and he wanted to pass laws that said deaf people could not marry each other. Deaf people hate him, and with good reason. And he and Gallaudet had a long-standing feud. Deaf art, from The Painful, Betty Miller talking about the abuses she suffered as a deaf child trying to being forced to speak. And Whimsical, Chuck Baird. I think I have some pictures we can look at in a second. Deaf poetry, which we won't get into, but there are some incredible artists and poets who utilize the language in ways that are incredible. And you have to kind of know the language to appreciate the symmetry of the poetry and the choice of the hand shapes and the structure. But they don't translate very well, but they're great. And
Vicky, by the way, asks if there are puns in ASL.
yes, there are. And, there ABC stories and number stories where the whole point of the story is to make the hand shapes go in the sequence of the alphabet and what the hand shapes related to the alphabet look like, or in the shape of numbers. And those are like puns, where it's like verbal plays on the hand shapes. So yeah, the protectiveness of deaf adults toward deaf children is an interesting phenomenon. There are, I mean, I've seen so many deaf adults just in emotional pain watching what happens to deaf children because they so relate to their own memories. Um, so it's a pretty strong phenomenon. So let's see, let's just flip through a couple more slides. So we'll move on past Alexander Graham Bell, the Congress of Milan. Okay, Betty Miller. She's deaf, had deaf parents, and was a fluent signer, and went to a school where she was forced to sit on her hands, and her hands were whipped if she used them to communicate with other children. So this is a piece of her art with, you know, the shackled hands, chopped apart. And this was probably from the 1970s. She died in 2012. Next. This is also Betty Miller, and this is a hard one to see. I had trouble finding a good, a high resolution picture of this, but it's the Bell School, the Alexander Graham Bell School, 1944. And if you look, their hands are folded and their mouths are like ventriloquist dummies. Betty Miller's take on cochlear implants. And this is just another piece, I think, where she was maturing, but it's the sign for trees. So that's kind of a cool piece. Chuck Baird, his stuff is just sort of whimsical and fun. So these are tortoises with the hands and the sign, the shape of the sign for tortoise. The tiger. And I like this one. It's this guy's signing color, and then the hands. Ella Mae Lentz is a beautiful poet. And this is a poem that she created called To a Hearing Mother, where she talks about the importance of including members of the deaf community in the lives of deaf children and wanting to partner with the mother who is grieving the fact that her child is deaf. But it's without being able to really analyze it bit by bit, it's probably not worth looking at together, but just to know it's a lovely poem. And let's see what else is there. Things we could talk about, those videos of deaf babies getting their cochlear implants and hearing their daddy's voice for the same time, for the first time, why we should not be sharing those. The research about language acquisition of babies with deaf parents has revealed some interesting information about cognition and language abilities of infants. And again, I've mentioned this about deaf people and their concern about the life experiences of deaf children. So where are we? Yeah. So
That's the last slide.
Yeah. So we won't be doing a sign language class because I'm not really in a position where I could show you things. So let's end the slideshow and open up for any questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Patricia. And let me ask everybody to unmute. Okay, go ahead and unmute, please. And Patricia, you might check the chat. There's a couple of questions that have come up.
And let me see if I can figure out how to find the chat. I've got speaker view.
It's on the bottom of the Zoom window, typically.
Next to participants.
It's always been on the right side for me.
Okay.
Rolling. The toggle tool, what's it labeled?
It just says chat.
Action.
So if anybody has questions for Patricia, just yell it out, please.
Hey, Patricia. This is
Yes.
Buck.
Hey, Buck.
remember the movie Children of a Lesser God?
Oh, yes.
There's a scene in there where Marley Matlin, who's the deaf student,
Right.
is talking to William Hurt, and she tells him that, I mean, there's this clash between them because of her deaf culture, and he's a hearing person who's a teacher in a school for the deaf.
Right. I remember
He tells
that.
him that he tells him that his signs are boring.
Yes. Well, and that's what deaf people used to think was going on with hearing people who were trying to sign, because they had no facial expression. But it wasn't expression. It was actually language. There were parts of the language that just weren't understood and couldn't be taught at the time.
This is Bennett. I could dominate the hour, but I won't do it. My brother is deaf since age 8 from meningitis. And the first thing that I got in late, Patricia, I noticed that you were talking about the facial expressions. Well, David has been very active in the Deaf Association and Affairs for years and years, and goes all over the country to speak at their conferences and so on. And he says that he is deadly tired when he gets through making a speech. Now I know why.
Yes.
I had never thought about the facial expression sort. But the family, we never did learn the sign language. And David didn't either. He went to public school until he got to Gallaudet. And there he was a pariah because he didn't know, but he plugged in quickly. So
Yeah. No, I've really enjoyed, meeting David and talking to him several times when he's been here for dinner at the Common House. And, his experience was different from a lot of deaf children because he became deaf when he was 8. So he could already speak English and he was already literate. So he could read and write. So he was able to gain his education through literacy, even if he couldn't understand what the teachers were saying in the class. They could write notes back and forth to him, and he could read the books, and he could learn that way. Deaf children who are born deaf or become deaf at a really young age have a very different experience.
well, I do this again. David was the subject of research over about, 10 or 12 years with NASA because they could perform experiments because of their deafness, which did not tie up the astronaut candidates. And he did that for about 10 years. So the latest is NASA has compiled an oral history of that research. And so David and one other man, they're the only ones who are alive and able to go. So they went recently to Houston, and I got a 44-page report of the oral history that they compiled.
Interesting. Yeah, I've seen some of those articles, and a lot of deaf people have, especially people like David, who became deaf. Well, he became deaf from illness, right? When he was 8, he probably
Meningitis.
meningitis, yeah. Will also destroy certain parts of their vestibular system in the middle ear. And that was probably what allowed them to do all of those weightlessness experiments without getting sick, which is why they were looking for deaf subjects.
I do like the phrase oral history of deafness.
Yes, yeah, that's kind of interesting. Yeah.
Patricia, somebody was asking about deaf sign singing on the chat.
Oh, yeah, all those hearing people who like to sign and sing. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So they're not deaf.
Well, all right. So I have a friend. She lives locally. She's hearing, but her mother was deaf. And she told me one time, she said, I used to love to sign songs, and I'd go in my bedroom and I'd play the music and I would interpret it and I would dance and I would sign all these songs. And I always wanted to show my mother, and my mother was like, yeah, whatever. And she said, I just couldn't understand why she didn't enjoy watching me sign these songs to her. She said, and then one time I did it without the music, and I looked and I thought, that looks really dumb. So the people who enjoy the sign singing are usually hearing people who can hear and enjoy the music, and the signs look kind of fun with it. But if you really try to understand what they're saying, if you match the signs up with the music, you can just never make it make sense linguistically. It does remind me of the worst, I would say, the worst and most culturally insensitive performance ever in a North Carolina deaf conference event sponsored by the state government. Was a group of deaf children ringing handbells for an audience that was about half deaf adults. It was so horrible. It was just so horrible. There was like a hearing choir director pointing to the children to tell them when to ring the bells. And like half the people in the audience were deaf people who just were like looking at each other and rolling their eyes and just pitying the children who were standing there being told to be proud of themselves for doing this horrible. It was just terrible. That was probably in the late 80s, early 90s.
So we have a question from Ann Pusey, who asked, does Hebrew sign backwards? I don't know why that would come from Ann, but
Well, because sign languages are
Annie-
not based on the spoken languages of the communities that they come from. Probably not.
It may be that Ann is sharing her computer with Jonathan.
oh
Yeah.
my gosh, that had not occurred to me.
It occurred to me.
You got against cochlear implants.
Make not
You're
deaf.
asking what I have against them?
What's the beef against them?
What about rhythm and dance and
So, all right, so those are two different questions. Cochlear implants, rhythm and dance. I really enjoy the cheerleaders at Gallaudet at the football games. There is a particular rhythm that is the sort of traditional chant rhythm in American Sign Language, and it's the and that particular rhythm is repeated by the cheerleaders, and it'll be like fight, 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 or win, 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 win. And there's this, I mean, it's really kind of cool that it's a traditional, but it's visual, but it's rhythmically visual. I'm sure there are others, but it's there. I don't know. I mean, I can't speak to it in depth, but I know that it exists. And Buck, your question, cochlear implants, there is sort of radical, I don't even want to say radical, activist deaf opposition to cochlear implants as cultural genocide. So that's one position. But there are a lot of deaf people, including culturally deaf people, who have the technology and who don't object to cochlear implants, don't object to hearing aids for kids who can benefit from them. The problem isn't the technology. The problem is the bad medical advice that parents receive with the technology. So often, I know at UNC, at least in the 80s, 90s, maybe into the 2000s, and I don't know what they say now, but they would not give a cochlear implant to a child who was learning sign language. They wouldn't do the surgery unless the parents removed the child from a program where they would be exposed to sign language. So that's where the opposition comes in, not the technology itself, but because so many kids would receive the implants and spend what should have been educational time basically doing intensive auditory and speech therapy rather than being exposed to a full language where they could learn the curriculum. So I think that's where the opposition comes.
Well, David was heavily recruited by the cochlear implant. Now, I cannot say exactly with the manufacturer who, because he was a leader in the deaf field,
Right.
but he rejected it because he said it would just be a bunch of noise, and I don't want that.
Right.
Yeah, actually, if
Considering how old he was and how long he'd been without hearing, it's hard to know. I mean, he probably would have been a good candidate since he had the neurological experience of having heard as a child. You know, he probably still had neural pathways that could have been tapped into. Cochlear implants are a lot more successful for people who have lost their hearing than for people who've never had it.
so, Patricia, could I do a 30-second physics lesson?
Sure.
So our hearing, unlike light where we have 3 sensors, our hearing has thousands of sensors. Each of those sensors are tuned to a very specific frequency. And so when we hear something, we hear this richness of sound. Cochlear implants start out with just like 8 channels. I don't know what they're up to now, 30 channels, but a very small number of channels. And what's amazing about cochlear implants is with so few channels, people can understand speech. But one problem that will never be solved is that our enjoyment of music comes from the harmonics of each frequency, which span multiple frequencies, and the overtones from those frequencies, that richness. And so cochlear implant people cannot appreciate music. To them, it's just noise. And so a lot of what they hear to us would sound like noise, and they can, with training, understand speech, but it's not the same experience we have.
Well, and you know, Adrian, this is my son who was a candidate for a cochlear implant, went and when he was about 14, I guess, 13 or 14, had a conversation with, well, first a very disrespectful otolaryngologist at UNC who told me first, I never use sign language interpreters with my sign dependent patients. So I was in there interpreting for Adrian, but he had great questions. Adrian was a dancer and loved music, and with his hearing aids, even with a 90 to 95 decibel hearing loss, if he cranked up those hearing aids, he could hear, understand, and appreciate music. And so he wanted to know, if I get the implant, will I be able to hear well enough to talk to people on the phone? And the guy said he couldn't guarantee that. And he said, so what about music? Would I be able to hear the music, understand the music, and still be able to dance? And what is this?
Keep talking.
Licensing song. Okay. And so, and he, you know, he just couldn't promise him, but he said, you would no longer enjoy music. And Adrian said, well, that's, you know, basically a deal breaker. He did say, could I get an implant on one side and wear the hearing aid on the other? And then when I wanted to hear the music, I could turn off the implant and use my hearing aid.
Oh.
And that might have worked for him, but there were no guarantees. And he kind of liked what he had enough that he didn't want to get the implant.
Your brain would explode.
Well, and he was also old enough to appreciate, you know, and he had the language skills because he could sign fluently. We could actually discuss this and he could make an informed choice.
So are there other questions for Patricia before we show the
We're gonna
final
look at the
video?
halftime show from Gallaudet.
Yes.
That's great.
So
At that
Jonathan,
Patricia, is there controversy between using lip reading and sign language?
Well, it's Alexander Graham Bell versus Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet all over again, or Edward Minor Gallaudet, maybe. That there are many deaf people who are completely fluent in sign language who also wear hearing aids, have use spoken language, and can in face-to-face conversation hold their own with a combination of limited hearing and speech reading.
Do they still call that total communication?
Total communication was a philosophy that evolved into simultaneous communication, talking and signing at the same time, which leads to very poor sign language production. So total communication was a philosophy that was actually pretty well intentioned, but what it became in practice was not what it was supposed to be or what it was intended to be. So no, I don't know of any deaf people who say people shouldn't learn speech reading or become fluent in English. They just don't see it as, it's the forcing of young deaf children to work on their speech and speech reading at the exclusion of having full language. That's where the problem comes in. There's actually an organization that started in the last few years called Language First, and it's an advocacy group that says basically deaf children deserve a full, complete language and the ability to communicate and converse, to develop emotionally and cognitively. And it doesn't matter whether it's spoken language or sign language, but if they're not getting that with spoken language, then they need to be immersed in sign language.
So most intelligent deaf people are bilingual then?
Yes, that's really the goal, is bilingualism, and the English portion or the spoken language portion doesn't have to always be spoken. It can be through literacy.
My mother took David to a speech therapist and lip reading teacher for 6 years after his deafness. So within the family, we still use lip reading. But he says to me, well, you don't need to say anything because I already know what you're going to say before you say it anyway.
So before we let Patricia go, Sue had a question.
I just wanted to, I don't know if he's really there or not, but I see Preston's name up there. Preston, are you there?
Yeah, hi, I'm here.
Hi. You're Preston who's going to move into Karen's place?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Hello.
Oh,
Nice
hi,
to meet you.
Preston.
Hi.
Hi.
Just
Thanks
thought
for,
we'd take
yeah.
a chance to say hello.
Yeah,
thanks.
glad you're here.
Thanks for the invite. Yeah, it was a really good talk. Thank you.
Thanks.
Great.
So
Do you have
who
any
won
questions
the
for Patricia?
football game? Vicki, did you bring that up?
I brought it up at Vicky's suggestion.
Can we
Any
look at
final
it?
questions?
Are there any other questions before we take a look at the football halftime game?
Alan, go ahead.
Okay.
Okay.
I had a question about SEE, Sign Exact English, and its relationship to ASL.
Signing Exact English is a system developed by educators that borrows vocabulary from American Sign Language and includes invented signs that represent English morphological structures. And it's presented in English word order with added made-up signs to represent English grammatical morphemes. And so it takes about 3 times as long to produce as running speech. And so when people use it, I've seen the analysis of it, they start dropping the made up word endings and grammar morphemes and just use sign language vocabulary in English word order with no grammar. It's a disaster.
Yeah, that sounds like
I've seen it in practice in schools and actually seen like sign by sign transcriptions of what people actually sign when they think that they are conveying English.
Right.
It's, yeah,
Thanks.
way less than ideal.
Any final questions?
I do. My brother is an avid reader, constant reader, but I talked to him about deaf persons reading, and he says that they don't, because they don't have the image carryover. I think, is that
That's
what you would say,
interesting.
Patricia?
I know some deaf people who are avid readers, usually people who were fluent signers who learned to read English when they got to school. I don't know, but there are plenty of deaf people who don't read.
Okay, final questions? I think this will be a fun way to march us out. You ready? Here we go.
Can you turn up the volume on it?
What are they saying, Patricia?
I wish they didn't have the drum so that we could experience the deaf experience.
Well, I have a feeling they have the drum because these people can feel it.
Well, even if you don't feel it, here you can feel it in your chest.
Doctor.
What was this?
So, Patricia,
great.
were they actually signing real words there?
There were signs incorporated, but the point of it primarily was the dance and the movement. But there were signs in there about the football and winning and the bison. They referenced the bison several times.
With
you know,
that, yeah.
And the little fake out where they were talking about, you know, our time is up, and they turned their backs to everybody, and then they turned around and it was like, I don't remember what they said. So there were, you know, there were signs incorporated, but it was more of an artistic sort of, I don't know, it's just interesting. A couple of things I noticed: the audience sounds, you know, deaf
Yeah.
audiences are loud when they're supposed to be noisy. I mean, are loud when they're supposed to be quiet, and quiet when you expect things to be noisy. The cafeteria at Gallaudet was like that too. And then the visual applause, they raised their hands in the air and waved their hands. So,
Thank you so much, Patricia. And
sure.
let's all thank Patricia.
Thanks for coming.
Well, I watched it. I turned the sound down so I could experience the like a deaf person.
It was kind of fun.
Thanks so much. And next week we have, I forget, but it should be fun, whatever it is.
Who's next week? It's the 18th. Do we remember?
Let me check.
It's not,
I'm sure it'll be great.
it's
I'm
not
sure it will
me.
be wonderful. Thanks so much, guys.
All right. Thanks,
See you
everybody.
soon. Thank
Good
you.
night.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Yeah, that was.